Hey, everybody. I am Clark Coffey, and with me here is Cullen McFater, and this is Soldiers of Cinema, a podcast where we explore the works and philosophy of legendary filmmaker Werner Herzog. What's up, Cullen?
Not much. I'm happy to be here. Happy to be back. It's a lot of fun.
I'm glad you're happy because, man, it would be weird if we were doing this and you were like really unhappy to be here. Like you were really
no
mad.
interest.
And you're like, I don't even know, why am I here? This sucks. I hate
I've
this.
got a big gallon of whiskey beside me. I just got to get through it.
Well, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe one of these days we can do an episode that's got like a drinking game in it, and we can,
that'll be our watchable commentaries.
Yeah, actually, hey, there you go. We'll do like some commentaries when we finally get through the Masterclass lessons and we get into Herzog's films. Maybe we can make a drinking game out of it at some point. All right, but anyway, well, I'm glad you're happy to be here. I'm happy to be here too. And for those of you listening, I hope that you're happy as well. I hope it's all just one big love fest. So, on today's episode, last episode, we went through and discussed lessons 1 and 2 in Herzog's Masterclass, and this episode here, we're going to go through lessons 3 and possibly 4. We're going to have to see how much time it takes to get through lesson 3, but that's where we're going to start today. So, we'll just dive right in. So, at lesson 3, Herzog comes right out of the gate with read, 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 read. Do you like reading, Cullen? Can you read? Do you agree?
Sometimes I question that. Sometimes I know many people who say no. No, I do enjoy reading. I actually, weirdly enough, though, I read probably more nonfiction than I do read
we
fiction.
Talked about that.
Yeah. I find that that's kind of what draws my mind, and which is odd because, when it comes to film, I much prefer to create in a fictional setting as opposed to, I love doing documentary, but
you prefer
my
narratives.
Heart certainly lies in narrative, yeah.
Well, I mean, so definitely in listening to Herzog, I think he makes it pretty clear that, in his opinion, reading is vital.
Yes.
To becoming the best filmmaker that you can be, and I think Herzog, when he talks about reading some pretty, in his words, high caliber stuff, and he has a couple examples that he mentions in the lesson, the Poetic Edda, which I do have to admit I have not yet read. And then he mentions the Peregrine, which I have read and can speak to in a few minutes. But I mean, so let's just start off with that basic first premise. I mean, do you agree with Herzog? Do you think that reading is vital to being a good filmmaker? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think that there is something stimulating about, while novels and literature aren't necessarily inherently visual mediums, I would say most people that read visualize when they read, and I think that's ever the more important as somebody who works in a visual medium like film, being able to visualize and being able to, even come up with specific shots on, that's what I find when I read sometimes. I'm like, how would I shoot this? Like, how would, what would the shot look like for this instance or this idea? How can you capture that in a visual medium? And so I think that just that exercise of allowing your brain to come up with visuals that are stimulated by either somebody else's work or even if it's something that's 1,000 years old, that I think is inherently helpful and valuable to anybody who wants to be a director or even, be a screenwriter or a cinematographer. I think that it all kind of plays into it. And I think that, reading is kind of like exercise for the brain, I find.
For sure. I think I would even go a little bit further. I think you're kind of talking about it in a bit of a practical sense, right? Where it's, exercising your imagination and visualizing, how to tell stories, visual manner. I would go further and say, I mean, boy, and how to articulate this? I mean, I think reading is just, it does so many things for you. And, especially, Herzog's examples are, one of his examples, I think, is only maybe 50, 60 years old or so. It's not that old, the Peregrine. And then the Poetic Edda is much older, and I'm not sure how much older, but I think it's maybe a couple thousand years old, and probably off by several hundred years, but it's older. But, sometimes it might be a little bit harder to pick up some of these older writings. But, I think, often there's a reason why they've stood the test of time. It's because they're pretty substantial works. But I think it's also, it's worthwhile kind of, we talked last episode about watching films from different eras and from different geographies, from different people. And I think that applies with reading as well, to, if you love comic books, that's great, but maybe expand your reading vocabulary and break out some of the classics. But I think reading,
to me, it's always about challenging too, right?
Sure, it's challenging.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned something like graphic novels or comic books or even audiobooks. Audiobooks have blown up in the past few years, but I always find that that even then is more of a passive experience. You're being read a story. Whereas even if you don't love sitting down and reading a book, a lot of the time it is, again, like I kind of said earlier, it's like working out. It's like, you're sitting there to work out the muscles that you might not always work out.
Well, and I think in a couple different ways. So that's a great point. And I'll add to that by saying that, some of the muscles that you're working out, I think in a practical sense, your attention span. And I think in today's day and age with the internet and, 140 characters or a quick Wikipedia page read or, a quick 5-minute article on whatever your favorite site is, everything is chopped into such small bite-sized pieces today. And I think if you do not get yourself inside a book on a regular basis, your attention span will start to shrink. And I've noticed that in myself. And it's scary. I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? It's I can't focus for more than a couple pages. Holy crap,
And even beyond traditional literature too. I think that even reading documents, whether it's historical documents, I would consider the Poetic Edda almost more of a historical document than, of course, it's an artistic, poetry kind of.
Right.
I almost said the word extravaganza, but even something like I read. I remember a few years ago, I just sat down one day and read the entire FBI file on the Zodiac killer, end to end. It was 300 pages, and I just went through the whole thing.
Doesn't Herzog bring up I think he requests or not request, but I mean he suggests you should read the Warren Commission report, right, on the assassination of JFK. I think that's in the assignment. PDF that goes along with this class. But so there you go. And we can kind of talk about, I don't know exactly what Herzog had in mind as to why you should read it, but, especially when he talks about how, facts don't make truth, but then he goes and assigns this reading of what is for the most part just an aggregation of facts, that Warren report. But it's interesting. But yeah, so attention span. But then I was also going to say, and probably more important, although obviously having an attention span is important to be able to hold long, complex stories in your mind and imagination. But your empathetic muscle is what I think is the ultimate muscle that reading exercises. And certainly, of course, film and music and other art mediums can activate your empathetic muscles. But I think that reading good literature is a unique combination of, of challenge, imagination, and, really, really working those empathetic muscles over a long period of time, where a story in a film may be an hour and a half, 2 hours, a television show might be 45 minutes to an hour, a song may be 5-7 minutes. I mean, holding this long, complex narrative in your imagination and really empathizing in nuanced, complex ways with these characters and situations and worlds that you may never experience in your regular life. I mean, over hours and hours and hours, I think what that can do for you as an artist and just as a human being, it can't be replaced by anything else. So, yeah, I mean, I guess we both agree. It sounds like we both agree. And I don't know, for everybody out there, I'd be interested, how much reading you do as a filmmaker. And is it something that you really carve out time for and do it conscientiously? I know.
Or do you disagree that maybe some people think that it's not necessary, right?
It might be. So, yeah, if we'll get some people, shoot us some emails and let us know. But, I mean, it's interesting to see, as Herzog describes his experience, being able to hold some of it sounds like some original manuscript on parchment of the Poetic Edda in his hands, and what kind of gravitas that kind of held for him is very interesting. I think it just illustrates how, the significance of being close to this. How would you even describe it?
I almost take it as, for him, it's like being able to touch another world of artists from 1100 years ago, right?
Absolutely.
Of like realizing this human connection on a very basis of just creation and creation of art and creation of what's funny to me about a lot of classical art, not contemporary, and I mean, dating back thousands of years, is that there has always been this sale of ideas, and maybe even if it's not for specific, literal money, there's this sale of, you have people consuming something that somebody else has created just from their brain. And I think, if anything, I think that might be at least my take on where Herzog kind of really connects with these like these old documents, is the fact that he's there now. He's doing that now. We're all doing that now. We're kind of living out this age-old tradition of civilization.
Well, and I think it's interesting too. His Cave of Forgotten Dreams, I think, is kind of shares or kind of illustrates maybe.
It's a really beautiful movie as well.
It's a very beautiful movie, and illustrates kind of that, Herzog's desire to kind of reach through the ages.
Yes,
and touch these ancient civilizations, like you kind of said. Yeah, it's very interesting, and there is a very profound sense to that. If you've ever been to an ancient some kind of ancient place in the world, it's like we went to my wife and I visited Skellig Michael off of the coast in Ireland, and it's one of the most ancient still standing I don't know what you would call it. There's like these stone huts. There was like a group of monks lived on this tiny island, and it's one of the oldest known, man-made structures still left in the world, and it's like older than the pyramids. And there really definitely is a powerful sense that you get being there.
I can even remember when I was in Rome, there is a church that I think was built in the 15th century, that was built on top of a pagan church that was built probably in the 300s, that was then built on top of like a nomadic village. And so when you enter this church in Rome, you go down these steps, you're probably 200 feet underground at this point at the bottom, and you're walking through these caves where these nomads used to live back, thousands of years ago, and you see these drawings on the wall and things like that. Wow. And I think one of the, it's funny that you mentioned Cave of Forgotten Dreams, because I think one of the really interesting parts where Herzog, in his narration of that movie, is where he says, perhaps the people who painted these walls would have been filmmakers today.
Yeah.
Would have been, it's there's such a through line of artistry.
Yeah. It's just, and it's just, I think it's one of the, just this thread throughout all of human history of our need for story. It's just, I think there's very fundamental connective thread that kind of runs through all of humanity, across culture, across geography, and across time. So, and that's really powerful. It's almost kind of sort of trying to glimpse and touch like a little piece of like pure distilled humanity, So I particularly kind of enjoyed his description of that in the lesson. And I think it's, you can do a little bit of that. You can replicate that, a little bit of that, by reading really good literature that's stood the test of time. And you don't have to go necessarily, halfway across the world or to the North Pole or to Rome, although these things are wonderful and you should travel as much as possible. But grab yourself a book at the library, or, buy one at the store, or download a file to your Kindle, or whatever you like to do. But, but yeah, it's pretty extraordinary, the power of story, and that's probably why all of us are here, because we all agree. So let's move into then a little bit of, it's funny. So Herzog kind of makes a bit of a little transition here at this point. He starts talking about editing, and talks about how you can learn from reading literature a little bit about what good editing is. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think Herzog's example, the kind of example that he gives in the lesson, is about when you see someone walking into a room or walking upstairs, you don't have to show all the busy work. You can cut from somebody entering a home to their bedroom, and you fill in the blanks. And I think the relation there, at least to me, is in the idea that when you're reading a book, you are reading between the lines of what the author is telling you. If there's there's inference, and it's very similar in editing, where you're not showing every single literal step of the way of this story. There is inference of, even if it's as simple as you see someone getting into a car and then you see them getting out of a car elsewhere, you've inferred that they are driving or have driven to that location. And I think that there's kind of this if anything, there is almost a subconscious begging of the audience to use their imagination to infer. And there's much bigger examples of that. Of course, there's movies that their entire stories are based on inference and based around interpretation, and the answers aren't given nearly as clearly as other films. But and I think
it goes film to film. Of course, there's. Yeah, it goes film to film, and certainly from piece of literature to piece of literature. I mean, here he kind of, he's jumping off from discussing the Poetic Edda, which is, a very condensed type of storytelling. It's, if you've taken a look at it, I mean, it's a poem, basically, in effect, and its form is very symbolic and very condensed. And so he's kind of, drawing this analogy of editing a film in that manner, that film should be story condensed.
Yes.
And obviously there's like a lot of literature that's very expanded, that's not condensed, but just in specifically, he had just come off of talking about the Poetic Edda. And I think, in general, so I've not read the Poetic Edda, but I haven't. But I have read a lot of poetry, and, I think good poetry is, you could define great poetry by kind of saying that it's story condensed, right? Each word is so chosen, so perfectly chosen and placed, that there's so much meaning and story behind, even just a line of a few words. I think that,
you look at haikus, right? Like haikus are literally 575, and it's
what is a haiku? How many? Is it like 3, 5, 3?
It's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5, and.
But isn't there even a shorter one?
There's
which one is the short? Like 353 or something, or 535?
There's a lot of like Irish ones are similar too. But you look at that and you go like, geez, but you can evoke so much out of something like that. You
really can.
And that's what I mean when I say it's about inference. It's about the audience or the reader being able to infer from those lines and to being able to visualize or use their imagination beyond.
So I guess I would say, not just reading is important. I would make even more explicit Herzog's call here that yes, reading is vital, but, reading really good poetry, I think, could be extremely helpful. And that's probably something that a lot of filmmakers might not think about immediately. You spend a lot of time studying, technical aspects of filmmaking, how to use the camera, how to set up shots, how to light things, even how to work with an actor, or, all these different things. And you may not read a lot of poetry, but I really would strongly suggest to grab some good poetry. And good is subjective, but I mean, try to find some things that speak to you. But good poetry, I think one of its many characteristics is that it is really compressed, efficient storytelling, which is vital, I think, for any good film. And I think you can learn a lot. I
think what's otherwise interesting about books too, and to kind of almost not be like really heady and grand about this is you must do this to be a good filmmaker.
Right.
They're great resources to just get ideas from. Like
Absolutely.
just to, even on the most basic level, just to read a book and rip
Great
an idea
point.
out of that's. Oh, there's this line about this person here that could actually make an entire movie, and I've had experiences like that where I've read something and gone, geez, that would honestly be a really interesting story on its own, just from a line or a paragraph of a book.
That's a really good point. And we hadn't even talked about that, but absolutely. I mean, you've got to fill the well in order to draw from it. And, look, it's garbage in, garbage out. I think we talked about that last time too. It's like, fill yourself up with as good a stuff as you can. I mean, literature and poetry, stories that have stood the test of eons, there's, it's if you spend your time filling yourself up with that stuff, it's likely that you're going to have better quality stories come out of you than if you spend all of your time watching reality television. I mean, I'll go out on a limb and make a really controversial statement here, but
yeah, whoa.
Not that there's not maybe a place for reality TV.
Herzog loves reality.
We can talk. Yeah, I mean, he even talks about pornography and how that he uses that as an analogy. We could talk about that later about how it's visceral and physical and real, and how that's missing in modern film. I don't think he intended to be promoting pornography, but he was making an analogy. But we could talk about that at another point. But yeah, so there's a place, but I think it is important to fill yourself up, and you will find some great ideas, and it's just something that could have been just a small tangent of something that you read, a line in a poem, or something a character does, or a certain something that was just a small part of what you were reading could just expand like a fractal into a whole new idea for you and send you off, really inspiring you. So absolutely. So there you go. Read.
Yeah, read.
I'm not even going to try to do my Herzog impersonation here. Maybe someday we could work up to that. But people are probably expecting it. They're like, come on, how can you have a Herzog podcast not do the Herzog voice? Well, maybe that's just part of, we have to keep some mystery. We have to keep you coming back for more. So maybe we'll do that at another time. But let's talk a little bit too about, so The Peregrine is a book that I did read and you did read. We read it when we took the class. Now it's been a bit, but Herzog really, really hammers on this one. He talks about look, he's like, if you want to be a good filmmaker, read The Peregrine. You have to read The Peregrine. It's hysterical. And I remember when, you and I were some of the first people that took this class, and Herzog's Masterclass was one of, I think, the first couple classes, right?
Yeah, there were like four at the time.
There were like four, and a matter of fact, one of them is no longer even available unless you purchased it when it was out. The Kevin Spacey Masterclass, which of course you can no longer find, and we all know why, which is interesting. That's a whole other interesting conversation. But yeah, it was one of the first lessons. Masterclass was a very young company, and I remember going on to Amazon to buy The Peregrine, and it was had gone from number 51,732 in sales to 5,
Yeah.
because everybody was skyrocketed because so many people were buying it. But I'm curious. I mean, what do you think it is about The Peregrine that Herzog finds so important? What do you think is motivating him so strongly to share that, in your opinion? And what were your thoughts on it, having read it?
I mean, I think in a conversation we've had before, you kind of put it really well, which is that it is about the writer becoming the subject rather than judging the subject. And I think that kind of is a very apt way to put it, is that I think that it is there's so many points in that book where it's about feeling the wind through through your entire being, and the reverberations of speed through your essence and things like that. It's so evocative, the language of how you feel like a peregrine when you're reading it.
It's really beautiful. Yeah, it really is a beautiful book.
But no, I think that's really, and even in the idea that Herzog kind of mentions this idea of judgment and getting rid of judgment when you're presenting a subject, be it in documentary or be it in fiction work, and become that subject, even if the audience doesn't, even if you show a film where you were totally in on this main character or whatever, and the audience doesn't connect to them, your movie is likely going to be better off for it, because you are going to have a point of view when you tell that story, as opposed to just being observational.
Well,
be the hornet that stings. That's his classic quote, right?
Well, there's so many different points. I mean, I would just say, just purely, if anybody listening out there hasn't read The Peregrine, you're thinking about it, maybe you either have or have not watched Herzog's Masterclass, and maybe you've heard of the book before, maybe you haven't. I will just second Herzog's advice or suggestion, and yes, you should read it, if for no other reason than it really, really is an extraordinarily beautiful book. I was like, I had no idea what this book was. I'd never heard of it. I had no preconceived notion. I'm like, okay, it's about a bird. Okay. Herzog says to try it. I guess I will. It's only a few bucks, but I was frankly blown away. I was extremely
and it's not
moved.
That long either.
No, it's not that long. It's not that long. It's maybe a couple hundred pages, just, a couple afternoons. You can read it pretty quickly, but I was really surprised by how moved I was by that book.
Yes.
And I think for me, there was a couple, you're right, it's the author is in such awe of the peregrine that he is observing over time, that he does in a way become the subject. And again, I'll go back to using this word empathy. His level of empathetic ability is so strong that he becomes this animal, and you really get a sense of that in his description of it over time. And it's a really excellent example of a handful of things that I just want to take a minute to discuss. I mean, so it's an extraordinary example of condensed storytelling. I mean, it is very poetically written book. It's just on that level, it's amazing. But it's also an extraordinary example of empathy from a storyteller. And I remember, when I first started to get into this world of filmmaking and storytelling, it was from the perspective of an actor. I was pursuing acting. I was doing acting, studying acting. And that was, one of the first things that I learned, but it takes time to really master, was to never sit in judgment of your character, right? If you're in judgment of your character, then you can't be the character. And so I think whether you're a writer or an actor or a director, this is a really key point. You really can't overemphasize this. If you are sitting in judgment of your character, or of this character, if you're an actor, of the character you're playing, if you're the director of the characters in your story, if it's a documentary, if you're sitting in judgment of the people that you're talking to, like you and I, when we worked on this, that documentary that we're in the middle of about conspiracy theories, and we were interviewing people who had, to us, pretty far out conspiracy theories that they really believed. I mean, it's very tempting. It's very tempting to sit there in judgment of them, but you really have to work to suspend that and to empathize with them and kind of try to become one with them in a sense.
Yeah, and
this book
to
is a great
understand,
example.
I think that even beyond just simply character as well, any successful artist should understand the ins and outs entirely of their story, and should be able to empathize on a grander scale with that story itself, and in the story that they're telling. And you can really tell sometimes when a director doesn't necessarily understand the material that even sometimes they wrote themselves, or
even further. I mean, right? It's further than understanding. It's of course, it's one thing to understand, but to own right? To feel in your heart, to, instead of saying, it's like, again, I'll kind of go back to, if you're an actor and you're playing a character that does bad things, right? I don't know, he's a serial killer, or she's a, whatever horrible character. If you're sitting there and you're saying, gosh, this person is a bad person, they do bad things, I don't think that way, I wouldn't do that. Well, then boom, right there. Like, how are you going to inhabit this person? And it's and we could really expand on this, and you could talk about this for a long time, but I feel that it is so fundamentally vital for any artist in any medium to constantly be expanding and working and exercising your empathetic muscles, because that really is the heart of what you're here to do as an artist.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
not about how you put paint on a canvas, or how you chip away at the stone in a statue, or how you light a scene or write a story. I really feel that when you distill it all down to its most central essence, it's about how you empathize. And we could really, obviously we could really go off on that one. But I think to bring it back to the Peregrine and to the lesson here, that's a really great example. And it's also a good example of something else, which is so many different topics that we're going to get to talk about in greater length as we go through this. But it's a great example of, in my opinion, now Herzog doesn't talk about this or anything, but I do feel like it is indirectly important, and I think that Herzog shows this in his work as well. So Herzog, I personally find that none of his films are propaganda-ish or even didactic, right?
No.
And The Peregrine is an extraordinary example of a film that is not propaganda. It is not even didactic. It's not telling you how to think. It's not telling you what to do. But actually, this book is a really extraordinary pro-conservation book.
Mm-hmm. And I think, in line with what you're saying, is it allows you to get there to that conclusion on your own.
Through aesthetic awe.
Exactly.
Through aesthetic awe. And that is so key. Filmmakers out there, aspiring filmmakers out there, writers out there, please, please, please. It's, how to say this? Of course, we all have our ideals, and we have our, what we feel is right and wrong in the world, the things that we're passionate about. But when you sit down to create a work, so in this case a film, and this is strange, and it's so hard to speak directly to this, but if you sit down and you write a script and you're like, okay, I want to tell people that thing XYZ is bad, okay, and I'm going to craft a story around how I can express that thing XYZ is bad and we shouldn't do it, or we shouldn't think it. I feel like almost inevitably that turns out crappy. I just really do. Because I feel like you're putting your ideals ahead of the aesthetic, and that aesthetic awe is just stripped out of your art. And because I'll watch films where the ideals that are represented in the films are totally in line with my thoughts. Even like I'm like, I agree, that's bad, but this is a horrible film.
Exactly.
But this is such a great example. This book is such a great example of using aesthetic awe to bring people to an understanding of your ideals. And
Absolutely.
I don't know did you feel that too from that book?
Without a doubt. Yeah. I think that it was, even just to reiterate the word empathy, is through empathy you are somehow brought on the side of the author and their takeaway, without the author explicitly having to sit you down and say, this is what I believe and this is what you should believe too. Yeah, and it was it kind of just like emanated, radiated from his spirit. It's a really great life lesson, I think, because what I think that says to a lot of people is that when you disagree with someone in life, that oftentimes a better way to reach an understanding with that person isn't necessarily to throw facts at them or to throw statistics at them. For sure, it is to allow them to empathize with situations going on. That's very that's super super relevant, especially in today's climate.
Yes.
Where, rather than just yelling at people and throwing
which we have a lot of in today's day and age. Boy, don't we ever.
Just allow people to get to those conclusions on their own, and they will often now hold those views dearer than if you had just simply told them in the first place, right?
Well, and I'll even add to that too a little bit, just from my personal experience. So I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up outside of St. Louis, Missouri, in the suburbs of St. Louis, and like pretty far out from St. Louis. So I live in, it's a place called St. Charles. And at the time it was, we had like a gas station, and, the high school that I went to was like out in the bush wildlife, like the Anheuser-Busch family had this like big reserve, and it was like out in the middle of nowhere, right? Just so happened to be across the street from a super fun radioactive site, but that's so I glow sometimes at night. No, but I lived out in the middle of nowhere in this small town in the Midwest, and I lived we lived closer to the city, so I was exposed to diversity and different peoples and things, but when I went, for junior high on, we lived in a very homogenous place demographically, and not just demographically, but religious, like politically, religious, philosophically, a very, very homogenous conservative place. And I'll tell you, as a younger kid watching films like a great example I'll just point out was Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho. Watching that film, and it, back then it was like, it's not like I picked this film, because you couldn't do that back then. I was just like up at night watching movies, which I love to do. My parents had gone to bed, and I would creep back up into the living room, and I'd put on this big like air traffic controller headphones they had way back in the early 80s, because I'm old, and I would put, like, thankfully we had like HBO or whatever, so I'm get to finally control the one TV we had in the house and watch something that I wanted to watch. But I just had to watch what was on, and I remember so specifically My Own Private Idaho comes on. And, I had been taught through my, just through my religious education, which my parents, kind of had me go through, as it was something they believed in. And of course they exposed me to that. But it was a way to expose me to different people with different lifestyles, with different backgrounds and histories, and in a way that wasn't painting them as some fake perfect people, or some, they were real people with problems and challenges and whatever else, right? It wasn't like they were, but just like going through this journey with them, these stories, and kind of getting to become them as I watched the film, had such a profound impact on expanding my like experience with other people and other lifestyles and other religions and philosophies and beliefs. And so I cannot overstate how important that was for me, especially when I didn't have any other like role models or examples of that in my life at the time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it's an interesting connection.
And so, I feel like, but the Peregrine, although it's about a bird, yes, is such a great example of that. And I think that's what Herzog is speaking to here in his own way. I'm not trying to speak for him, but that's my interpretation of what he's, talking about, the absolute vital aspect of enlarging your empathetic heart as much as possible.
Yeah.
So, all right. Anyway, there's my story. But boy, we got off on. But it all.
But I think it's even just to add on to that real quick. What's interesting to me about that story, though, is like I've had similar experiences, and probably the most recent one, which to me took me majorly by surprise. Was because I wasn't young. It wasn't by any means the first movie I've ever seen, or the first type of movie I'd ever seen that kind of approached this way. But I don't know if you saw Greta Gerwig's Lady Bird, which was 2017 or 2018.
I actually have not yet.
And
I'm
I
aware of it, but I haven't seen it, unfortunately.
Yeah, for some reason, and it's literally a movie about a girl in Sacramento, California, who's trying to get into college, and so really on a basic level, no similarities with my life.
Yeah.
But I remember watching it, and for some reason it was like, because of those differences, I was able to empathize so much with the character and so much with the movie, and it hit me in this really weird way as I was watching it, where I was like,
it's
Jesus,
wonderful.
like I without trying to sound melodramatic, like I feel this movie. I know exactly what it's like. Yeah.
And it's it's tough because I mean we talk, and I, not to try to take this to a political place, I don't want to do that, but I will say that I think that so much of where we are today is coming from with so much division.
Yes, yeah.
I think really, this is an opportunity for us as artists to try to bring as much empathy as we can to the world. So, yeah, it's an opportunity for you fellow filmmakers out there. That's why we're here. So, all right. Well, so yeah, if you can't tell, we like the Peregrine. We agree with Herzog. We think it's a good read, and we highly recommend you check it out and let us know what you think of it. All right. So, it's funny, Herzog, who I think is actually hysterical, and it really cracks me up that he claims to not have a sense of humor, which, of course, is just yet more hilarity from Herzog, because
more self-contradiction.
He is so funny. Yeah. And of course, Herzog,
which I think is his
so
big joke.
He is so full of contradiction, which is just so awesome. I love it about him. But he's hysterical. He tells a story here at the end of this lesson 3 about encounters at the end of the world, which is a great flick if you've not seen it. And he's discussing his voiceover, and he's talking about kind of finding his own voice. And he tells this hysterical story about how he was inspired by unsolved mysteries of all things, which I just would have never guessed in a million years that would be something that A, he would be watching, B, that he would be inspired by. But that is hysterical, and you can really hear it. He uses the specific example of that narration where the part where the poor penguin
is going off towards the mountains.
Going off to die into the mountains all alone, and oh my gosh, that kills me.
And I think it's funny too, because you think of Herzog, like when he starts talking about this example where he says, finding your voice, and you think of like, oh, he's talking about, a figurative, finding your voice, but he's
right.
No, he's literally talking about what was his timbre going to be.
You're right. It's like, and I have to admit, I have not yet done narration myself, like documentary narration, and I'm maybe a little scared of it.
But that's what's funny, is that I did one for the documentary that I've got coming out right now. It's just being scored right now. But what's hilarious is I remember doing this documentary and doing my narration for it, and what was I doing but imitating Herzog? And I remember thinking at the time I was doing it, going,
consciously or subconsciously?
And not that I wasn't doing an accent by any means, but I was sitting there and I was like, I remember I did a first pass at the narration, and I just thought it was far too quick, and it was just, there was no weight to the words. And so then I went back and did the narration in his voice with accent, kind of going, we are at the edge of the world, finding things like that. And then I just kind of took the voice out and went instead to saying, like, we're at the edge of the world, and using his diction and kind of the places. But I remember feeling kind of cheap about that and going, am I just ripping the guy off because he's a master narrator?
Sure.
And then finding out that he had ripped off Unsolved Mysteries kind of
did it make you feel better?
Took that weight off my shoulders, where I was like, oh yeah, even the greats,
sure,
understand that nothing is wholly original.
Isn't that the age old, right? Like expert steal, or professional steal, whatever, I think for sure, and it is interesting. We can speak a little bit too, because I think there is he does kind of speak a little bit to that that metaphorical voice, right? Your inner voice, your opinions, your angle, your perspective, right? I think he does kind of suggest that, there is, and he's talked about this in other places too, which is why I can kind of, you can kind of suss that out a little bit more from this very brief discussion, a couple sentences here at the end of this lesson. But he talks about this at greater length in other interviews and in some of his books about, a lot of people are so consumed and worried about finding their authentic voice. And, I need to use film to figure myself out as almost like a therapy to find, who am I and where am I coming from? And, I'm sure that you've heard a lot of this, and maybe you've even, come from that angle. I know I have. I know that I definitely have. I think Herzog kind of poo-poos that a little bit, and he's like, no, you don't need to do any of that. You don't need to like sit there and go inside yourself and use the film as a way to explore your inner child. And, it's definitely not, it's definitely not Herzog's style. But again, though, it's interesting. And he is certainly full of contradictions because, of course, I think he actually does do that in his films to some extent. I think that, I think he does, but that doesn't mean that his comment doesn't hold some validity at all. I think that, in all of the ways that you kind of hear about how Herzog works, whether it, the sense of urgency that he creates for himself, the fury that he works himself into when he writes, the physicality of his shooting, the lack of storyboards, and all of these type of things. I mean, I think he's constantly trying to keep himself in a zone where he is not absorbed by a looking in. Right.
Yes.
An absorption of like self-awareness or, and I would agree. I mean that, when you're in a state of flow and you're not thinking about yourself, I think that's when I do the best work. Whenever I'm kind of self-conscious and I'm, well, what's my voice here and what am I trying to say? It usually doesn't come out very well, frankly, if I'm conscious about it, right? If it's like a self-conscious way, I think there's no way for your authentic voice to not be there. Frankly,
exactly.
Right? I mean, it's like
everything that you do will have a personal touch on it.
Absolutely, of course it will. But I think it is easy to get caught up in that. I think I know I have. Boy, I definitely have. I mean, I can speak from such experience about, what's my authentic voice? And, I really have. And it's kind of one of my personal challenges is to kind of drop that, let that go, and just have faith and trust that whether it's in the writing process or whether it's, as I write out a shot list or I'm there on set, whether I'm an actor or I'm operating camera or I'm directing, that whatever I'm doing, you just have faith that, yes, like you're going to come through. So I don't know, has that ever been something that's challenged you in your creative process? It certainly has me.
I think it's something that I've learned to kind of not worry about, if that makes sense. Just to kind of understand that, whatever voice I have will likely come through.
Yeah.
Again, as I said, naturally. Just every person has a fingerprint, and an artistic fingerprint, and
yours is Canadian.
Yes, exactly. Exactly, just like my beer.
Just like your beer. I love it. I actually prefer the way you pronounce bean.
Bean. Oh,
but yeah,
I've
been to the store.
I've been to the store,
but you don't say bin. You say bean.
Some people do, some people don't. There's a little bit of local diction here. If I said, let me think. Like if I'm I would say. I think I say bin. I think I've said
no.
I've been on
we can go back to the tapes. I can go back to the tape. Anyway,
you're right. You're right. Actually,
not get carried away. I was just making a small joke, but that's great though. I mean, and especially not to sound like an old fart, not like your dad, but at your age, I think that's awesome. I mean, I really do think that a lot of, and we will touch on more and more of these things as we go through more lessons. We've just covered 3 here, and the next one we'll do 4, and we'll keep going. But I think so much of what Herzog does, and I don't know if it's really a conscientious kind of thing, or if it's just he's intuited this, right, and it's become a part of his process, and he just intuited it. But staying away from all of this over analytical, over processing, overthinking, which is what we're doing right here in this podcast now. There's a little bit of irony there, but I think when he's in his creation mode, staying away from that, I think is really vital. But what's interesting is that and you can see this. So when he's working on a film, he's kind of moving away from this over analytical, self-conscious place. But then he's got another mode, and he actually spends quite a bit of time interpreting his own work, analyzing his own. He says he doesn't, but look at all the interviews that he gives. Look at all the speaking engagements where he goes through his films in great detail and discusses it with people. He's done like Herzog on Herzog, and where there's just 500 pages of interviews. I mean, you can find more of Herzog talking about his films with other people and his philosophy of filmmaking than almost any other director I know. Yeah, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
So maybe that kind of shows that you can kind of, right, there's a yin and a yang, and you can have both. You can get into discussions and kind of intellectually or conceptually analyze these things, but then when you're creating, let's flip the switch, let's turn that off, and let's get,
let's be in the moment. I mean, it's the same kind of philosophy of, like, even on a set, a director that's not misguided, but a director that is kind of all over the place, thinking of the next 6 shots in the movie and not just thinking about the one that they're on right now is often
being present.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. I do think a lot of it seems like, as he describes it, a lot of his process is designed to kind of keep that. Let's stay in this present moment, stay right now. And then when you remove all of this self-consciousness, that's actually when it's funny. It's, like a lot of things, there's kind of the truth is kind of a paradox. When you've stopped worrying about your authentic voice is when it arrives and moves through you. So, all right. Well, I think that's probably a good note to end this on, unless you've got anything last thoughts to add. Excellent. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation here on Herzog's Masterclass Lesson 3. I appreciate you hanging out with me, Cullen. Thank you so much for that.
That was great.
And we'll look forward to Lesson 4 next week. So thanks for listening, everybody. We will catch you on the flip side. Take care.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Bye.
All right.